The flashing red and blue lights reflected off my windshield as my heart pounded against my ribs. The ambulance's siren wailed into the night, a desperate plea for urgency, but the path was blocked, by none other than the self-proclaimed HOA security, their arms crossed, their smug expressions making it clear they weren't moving. My mother, barely conscious in the back, gasped for breath, each second slipping away like sand through my fingers. The so-called officers stood firm, citing an unpaid HOA fee as their reason for halting an emergency vehicle. I felt a surge of rage and disbelief. This wasn't just a case of overreach, this was playing with a life. And in that moment, I knew, they had no idea what storm they had just unleashed upon themselves. My fingers clenched around the steering wheel, my knuckles widening as my vision blurred with anger. The paramedics were yelling now, their voices slicing through the suffocating tension, demanding to be let through. But the HOA enforcers, 3 middle-aged men in navy blue polos with embroidered security badges that held no legal weight, stood their ground. Their leader, a graying man with a self-important smirk, tapped on my driver's side window, shaking his head as if I were an unruly tenant daring to challenge their authority. He lifted a laminated sheet, jabbing at a bold-printed warning, "No emergency vehicle access granted to residents with outstanding dues." My stomach churned with a mix of fury and disbelief. This wasn't some overdue cable bill. This was a life-or-death situation, and they were treating it like a petty dispute over landscaping violations. The paramedics weren't waiting for permission anymore. One of them, a young woman with determined eyes, swung open the back doors and leaped out, storming toward the barricade of self-imposed enforcers. The lead HOA officer raised a hand, wagging a finger like a disapproving principal. His voice, oily and condescending, carried through the night air. "Rules are rules," he declared. My jaw locked, my fists tightening, as I forced myself to remain calm. There was no reasoning with men like him, men who thrived on control, who found satisfaction in exerting their minuscule power over others. But I wasn't about to let them decide my mother's fate. I leaned forward, my voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. I demanded they step aside. I threatened legal action. I even pulled out my phone, recording their faces, making it clear I wasn't going to let this slide. But they laughed. Actually laughed. As if I were the fool for thinking logic and law would matter in the twisted little kingdom they had built. The seconds stretched into an eternity, and I could hear my mother's ragged breaths growing fainter behind me. My hands shook as I dialed 911, desperation laced in my voice as I explained the situation. The dispatcher sounded just as stunned as I felt, promising that real officers were on their way. But I knew time wasn't on my side. Every second wasted on HOA power plays was a second stolen from my mother's chance at survival. The paramedics attempted to maneuver around the blockade, but the HOA guards, drunk on authority, moved to block them again. My mind raced, grasping for any solution, any way to break this absurd, nightmarish standoff. Then, without thinking, I threw the car into gear and inched forward, the engine rumbling a warning. I wasn't asking anymore. For the first time, a flicker of doubt passed over the enforcers' faces. I could see them scrambling, realizing that maybe, just maybe, they had overplayed their hand. The leader took a half step back, but his arrogance wouldn't let him fully retreat. His hand hovered over his pocket, as if debating whether to call in some manufactured reinforcements. But before he could act, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night. Real law enforcement was on the way. And the moment those flashing red and blue lights appeared at the entrance of the neighborhood, I knew, this was far from over. This was only the beginning. The wailing sirens grew louder, cutting through the thick tension that had settled over the standoff like a storm waiting to break. The HOA enforcers stiffened, their postures shifting ever so slightly as real authority approached, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across their faces. The lead officer, the smug, graying man who had so confidently blocked the ambulance, turned his head toward the flashing lights of the incoming patrol cars. His arrogance wavered for just a second, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He squared his shoulders, trying to maintain the illusion of control. The other two enforcers hesitated, glancing at one another as the weight of what they had done began to sink in. The paramedics didn't wait for permission this time. The second the first patrol car screeched to a stop, they rushed forward, forcing their way past the human blockade and pushing the stretcher toward the waiting ambulance. Relief surged through me as I watched them work, but the rage still simmered beneath my skin. My mother had lost precious minutes to this absurd display of power, and I wasn't about to let it slide. The police officers wasted no time stepping out, their eyes narrowing as they took in the scene. One of them, a tall man with a hardened expression, scanned the paramedics tending to my mother before turning his focus on the HOA guards. His gaze locked onto the so-called leader, who was now fumbling for words, shifting on his feet as he tried to come up with an excuse. I could see the moment he realized he was in over his head. He straightened his polo, lifting his chin as if that could restore his authority, and began spewing some nonsense about community policies, unpaid fees, and restricted access. He spoke as if he were addressing unruly tenants rather than law enforcement officers, his tone dripping with condescension. But the officer wasn't buying it. His expression remained cold, unimpressed, as he folded his arms and asked the only question that mattered: had they knowingly blocked an emergency vehicle? The air grew thick with an almost tangible sense of realization, as if the consequences of their actions were finally dawning on them. The two other HOA enforcers took a subtle step back, suddenly unwilling to be so closely associated with their leader's decision. I forced myself to take a slow breath, my hands still shaking from the frustration and fear that had gripped me moments before. My mother was finally receiving the care she needed, but I knew this wasn't over. The lead officer's voice faltered for the first time as he tried to spin the situation, claiming that it wasn't a complete blockade, that the paramedics could have worked with them to resolve the issue before trying to push past. I felt my anger spike all over again at the sheer audacity of his words. This wasn't about logic or policies, this was about control, about power games played at the expense of real lives. Before I could stop myself, I stepped forward, my voice firm and unshaken as I laid out exactly what had happened, making sure every single word carried the weight of truth. I recounted the unnecessary delay, the threats, the smug laughter, and the sheer indifference to the fact that a life had been on the line. I could see the officers listening, their expressions darkening with each detail. The moment the paramedics confirmed my story, detailing the resistance they had faced while trying to reach my mother, the shift in the atmosphere became undeniable. The police officers were no longer just investigating, they were preparing to act. One of them turned to the lead HOA enforcer, his voice clipped and professional as he asked for identification. The man bristled at the request, clearly unused to being the one answering to authority rather than wielding it over others. He huffed, rolling his eyes, and reached into his pocket for his wallet, as if the entire thing were a mild inconvenience rather than a serious legal matter. His arrogance was a mistake. The moment his ID was in the officer's hands, everything changed. The officer's eyes flicked over the card before raising a brow, questioning the validity of the security title this man had been so confidently throwing around. It took only a few moments to confirm what I already knew: this man and his little team had no real authority. They were nothing more than community-appointed enforcers with no legal jurisdiction. And now, they had interfered with emergency services. The officers didn't need further convincing. The lead enforcer's smug expression finally cracked when one of the officers informed him that he was being detained for obstruction of emergency services. His face drained of color, his bluster disappearing in an instant as the officer stepped forward, instructing him to turn around. His hands hovered near his sides, his body stiffening as if debating whether to resist, but the reality of the situation was unavoidable now. The other two enforcers, sensing the walls closing in, quickly began to stammer excuses, distancing themselves from their leader's decision. They claimed they hadn't meant for it to escalate, that they were just following instructions, but it was too late. One officer informed them that further investigations would determine their level of involvement, and for now, they weren't free to leave. The tension in the air snapped as the lead enforcer's wrists were pulled behind his back, the unmistakable sound of handcuffs clicking into place cutting through the night. I exhaled slowly, watching as the man who had so confidently played with my mother's life was finally forced to face the consequences of his actions. The officers led him toward the patrol car, his face a mask of disbelief, as if he still couldn't comprehend that his so-called authority had crumbled beneath him. The ambulance doors shut with a finality that sent a rush of relief through me. My mother was on her way to the hospital, finally getting the care she needed. But as I watched the patrol cars prepare to leave, I knew this wasn't over. The HOA had shown its true colors tonight, and I wasn't about to let them continue wielding unchecked power. This was just the beginning of a battle they never saw coming. The flashing patrol lights faded into the night as the police escorted the detained HOA enforcer away, his once arrogant posture replaced with rigid disbelief. But even as the immediate danger had passed, the storm inside me had not settled. My mother was finally on her way to the hospital, but the fact remained, her life had been put at risk over something as trivial as an unpaid fee. The sheer audacity of these self-proclaimed enforcers, their blatant disregard for human life in favor of flexing their imaginary authority, sent a fresh wave of fury through my veins. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about the unchecked power the HOA had been allowed to wield for far too long. And if they thought I was going to let this slide, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I stood near my car, the cool night air doing little to soothe the heat boiling beneath my skin. The remaining two enforcers lingered awkwardly, no longer posturing as figures of authority. Without their leader to hide behind, they had no choice but to face the weight of what had just happened. Their eyes darted between each other, their earlier confidence now replaced with growing anxiety. It was one thing to push around homeowners with made-up rules and petty fines, but standing in the way of an emergency vehicle had pushed them into territory they weren't prepared for. I could see the wheels turning in their heads, calculating how much damage control they would need to do, how they could twist the narrative in their favor. But I wasn't going to give them that chance. I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolling through the footage I had captured. Every second of their obstruction, every smug smirk, every dismissive wave of their hands, it was all there, undeniable and incriminating. I knew exactly what to do next. My first call was to the local news station. If the HOA wanted power through intimidation, then I would use the one thing they feared most, exposure. I could already imagine the headlines, the outrage that would ripple through the community once people saw how far their so-called security had gone. This was no longer just a case of excessive HOA enforcement. This was obstruction of emergency services, an act so reckless and dangerous that it demanded public scrutiny. My second call was to a lawyer. I had no doubt there would be legal consequences for their actions tonight, and I intended to make sure they faced every single one of them. If the HOA wanted to operate like some lawless entity, it was time for them to be reminded that they were bound by real laws, ones they had violated in the worst way possible. As I made my way home, exhaustion began to creep in, but it was overpowered by the determination settling deep in my chest. This fight wasn't just for me. It was for every resident who had ever been strong-armed by the HOA, every homeowner who had been fined for ridiculous reasons, every person who had felt helpless under their authority. They had gone too far, and now, they would face the consequences. The next morning, the storm truly began. News crews arrived at my doorstep before the sun had even fully risen, eager to hear the first-hand account of what had happened. I laid out every detail, holding nothing back, showing them the footage I had captured. Their reactions mirrored my own disgust, their outrage evident as they scribbled notes and prepared their cameras. By midday, the story had gone live, spreading faster than even I had anticipated. Social media exploded with fury, residents from all over the neighborhood, and even beyond, sharing their own horror stories about the HOA's abuses of power. The outrage wasn't just local, it was viral. But the true reckoning came when the city council got involved. Calls flooded their offices, demands for action growing louder by the hour. It was no longer just about one incident, it was about a pattern of unchecked authority, a system that had been left to operate without accountability. Within days, an official investigation was launched. The remaining HOA board members scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, issuing carefully worded statements about misunderstandings and unfortunate incidents. But the damage had been done. The HOA was in the spotlight, and no carefully crafted statement was going to erase the public's fury. Residents gathered in record numbers for the next community meeting, their voices unified in their demand for change. And then, the final blow landed. The HOA enforcer who had been arrested that night was formally charged with obstruction of emergency services, a crime that carried serious legal consequences. He had spent years intimidating homeowners, ruling over them with fabricated authority. But now, he was just another man facing the weight of the law. His arrest set off a domino effect, more investigations, more resignations, more cracks forming in the foundation of the HOA's control. The neighborhood that had once operated under their thumb was no longer afraid. The power they had so confidently wielded had slipped through their fingers, replaced by something they had never expected: resistance. I stood at the edge of the next community meeting, watching as new leaders stepped forward, ones who spoke of transparency and fairness instead of control and intimidation. The HOA was being dismantled, its rules restructured, its enforcers removed. The organization that had once operated as an unchecked force of power was finally being held accountable. As I listened to the discussions, a sense of satisfaction settled over me. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. The HOA had thought they could get away with endangering lives, but in the end, they had only sealed their own fate. And as I walked away from the meeting that night, the weight that had once pressed on this neighborhood felt lighter than ever before. The fallout was even greater than I had anticipated. The viral exposure had sent shockwaves through the community, and the city's legal team wasted no time digging into the HOA's past actions. What started as an investigation into one incident quickly snowballed into a full-scale audit. Residents who had once suffered in silence found their voices, coming forward with years of buried grievances, unlawful fines, threats of foreclosure over trivial violations, harassment tactics disguised as enforcement. It was as if the floodgates had opened, and the HOA, once a towering force of control, was now drowning under the weight of its own corruption. The media latched onto every revelation, turning the situation into a spectacle that could no longer be ignored. The HOA board members, who had once thrived on their unchecked authority, were now scrambling to contain the damage, but it was far too late. Their carefully curated image of community protection had been shattered beyond repair. As the investigation deepened, the extent of the HOA's misconduct became clearer. Financial records were pulled, revealing misappropriated funds, unapproved fees that had lined the pockets of those in charge, and deliberate targeting of homeowners who had dared to challenge their rule. A class action lawsuit was brewing, with dozens of homeowners uniting against the very organization that had once held them hostage with its rules and regulations. Legal teams combed through the years of fraudulent activity, and the deeper they dug, the uglier it became. The city council, now under immense pressure from public outrage, had no choice but to intervene. Within weeks, emergency measures were put in place to suspend the HOA's governing power until a full legal review could be conducted. The very enforcers who had once lorded over the neighborhood now found themselves powerless, their authority stripped away like a badge ripped from a disgraced officer. But the most satisfying moment came when formal charges were filed. The lead enforcer, the smug man who had blocked my mother's ambulance without a shred of remorse, was facing more than just obstruction charges now. With new evidence unearthed during the investigation, he was also being charged with fraud and abuse of authority. The realization of his downfall had been slow, painful, and completely deserved. The two remaining enforcers who had stood by his side that night were not spared either. Their attempts to distance themselves had failed, as evidence proved their complicity in years of harassment tactics and illegal enforcement. Watching them walk into the courtroom, no longer the ones in control, was a moment I would never forget. The men who had treated the neighborhood like their own personal kingdom were now at the mercy of a justice system that did not recognize their fabricated authority. With the HOA's grip broken, the community began to breathe again. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted: no more random inspections, no more absurd fines, no more unqualified security patrolling the streets as if they were law enforcement. The residents, once fearful of stepping out of line, now stood together, reclaiming what had been stolen from them for so long. The board was dismantled, and in its place, a new group of leaders emerged, people who actually cared about the well-being of the community rather than exploiting it. Policies were rewritten, corrupt practices were abolished, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood belonged to the people who lived in it, not the power-hungry few who had controlled it. As I walked through the streets that had once felt suffocating under the weight of the HOA's rule, I felt an unfamiliar yet welcome sense of peace. My mother had fully recovered, but the experience had left its mark on both of us. There was no forgetting what had happened that night, but at least now, we knew that change had come from it. The fight had been long, exhausting, and filled with more obstacles than I had anticipated, but in the end, it had been worth it. The HOA had tried to wield its power against me, against my family, against an entire community, but they had failed. Their downfall had been their own making, a result of their greed, arrogance, and refusal to acknowledge the limits of their control. I had started this battle because of an ambulance, but I had finished it for something far greater. The people who had once lived in fear were free, and the neighborhood that had once been a playground for power-hungry enforcers had finally been reclaimed. And as I stood there, looking at the place that had once felt like a prison, I knew with certainty that the HOA had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated the people they had sought to control. And in the end, that was what had destroyed them. The echoes of the HOA's collapse rippled far beyond what anyone had expected. News stations continued to cover the fallout, dissecting every misstep, every corrupt policy, and every unethical act that had been swept under the rug for years. What had once been a feared and untouchable governing body had now become the subject of public disgrace. Their iron grip had been shattered, not by force, but by the sheer weight of their own arrogance and the undeniable power of truth. But even as the headlines shifted and the legal proceedings dragged on, I knew that true change wasn't just about dismantling the past, it was about rebuilding something better in its place. The neighborhood, once trapped under the oppressive rule of the HOA, had transformed almost overnight. Where once there had been silence, a quiet fear of stepping out of line, there was now laughter, conversation, and a sense of unity that had been missing for far too long. Residents who had once avoided one another out of fear of being reported now worked together, sharing ideas on how to manage the community without tyranny. The absurd fines and restrictions were stripped away, replaced with fair, transparent guidelines that prioritized safety and cooperation rather than control. The streets, which had once been patrolled by overzealous enforcers looking for any excuse to issue citations, now felt open and welcoming again. For the first time in years, people felt free in their own homes. But even as life moved forward, the scars of the past remained. The legal proceedings against the former enforcers and board members stretched on, revealing even more layers of deceit. What had started as an obstruction charge had unraveled into a web of financial fraud, coercion, and unethical business practices that extended far beyond our neighborhood. As audits exposed stolen funds and fabricated expenses, it became clear that the corruption hadn't just been about control, it had been about greed. The HOA had functioned less as a governing body and more as a private racket, bleeding homeowners dry under the guise of community management. It was no longer just a neighborhood scandal, it was a criminal case. The lead enforcer, the man who had so confidently stood in the way of an ambulance, was now facing multiple felony charges. His smirk, once a permanent fixture of his arrogance, had vanished the moment he realized just how deep his trouble had become. The courtroom became his new domain, but here, he had no authority. The same man who had reveled in dictating the lives of others now had his own fate decided by a system he had once pretended to represent. His sentencing was a moment of collective justice, not just for me, not just for my mother, but for every person who had ever suffered under his reign. The weight of the law had finally caught up to him, and there would be no escape. The two other enforcers had fared no better. Though their charges weren't as severe, they weren't walking away unscathed. Their desperate attempts to plead ignorance had fallen flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. Their punishments varied: fines, community service, and permanent bans from holding any position of authority within neighborhood associations. They would never again be able to wield power over others, never again be able to hide behind fake badges and fabricated rules. Their downfall wasn't just a legal defeat, it was a stripping away of the illusion they had built their lives around. In the end, it wasn't just about one night, one incident, or even one corrupt organization. It was about the principle that no one, not even those who believe themselves untouchable, is above accountability. The HOA had built its empire on fear, intimidation, and unchecked power, but in the end, all it had taken was one act of resistance to set everything into motion. It had started with an ambulance being blocked over an unpaid fee. It had ended with the dismantling of an institution that had operated without consequences for far too long. As I stood on my porch one evening, looking out at a neighborhood that finally felt like home again, I realized that I had changed too. I had never intended to be the person who stood up against something so massive, but when faced with injustice, when pushed beyond my limits, I had done what needed to be done. And in the end, that had made all the difference. This was more than just a victory. It was a reminder, a lesson that power only lasts as long as people allow it to. And when enough people decide that they will no longer be controlled, no longer be silenced, no longer live in fear, then even the mightiest of tyrants will fall.